The fascinating thing about this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Neil Ferguson is that they're kind of operating in the space of public theologians. Though Jordan is sort of agnostic about his faith, he's also a psychologist. Neil is an atheist historian, and yet they're the ones talking to us about human mortality, the afterlife, the apocalypse to come, and public theologians have disappeared. Maybe we are in the end times. Let's get into it.
Hello, everyone watching and listening. Today I'm speaking with historian and author Neil Ferguson. We haven't spoken before, although I've wanted to for a long time. We discuss the historical and deeply mythological precedent of world-ending narratives, how the global doomsday ethos abdicates local responsibility while empowering the elite class, the out-of-control gigantism plaguing our administrative states today, and how we might strive as individuals to deal with the genuine tragedy of life, morally, humbly, and religiously.
That intro is actually pretty fascinating because he says a couple things really quick. He says that, these local catastrophes sort of have a way of abdicating individual freedom over to sort of power-hungry elites, and that there's this gigantism that is happening within our political structure. And I can't help but just think back to the last couple podcasts that we've done about giants from Genesis to Revelation, and even the idea that we sort of either manifest some of these egregores or that these spirits exist and people somehow come into contact with them and feed them, like the Tower of Babel. I don't think it was about just building a big structure. There were this group of people who all spoke one language. They were up to something a little bit more nefarious than architecture. And so Jordan, like a good author, is sort of writing this into the introduction without fully explaining what he's saying. He leaves those like breadcrumbs for you to kind of explore. Maybe that's a psychologist trick, but it's also good narrative, I guess.
And how we might strive as individuals to deal with the genuine tragedy of life, morally, humbly, and religiously.
And how we as individuals might deal with the tragedy of life. That's such a huge clue. So I think this conversation about sort of global catastrophe really does have a very personal application as well. Because as humanity globally goes through trauma, we also go through trauma individually. That's kind of the project of this podcast. We're sort of learning from Plato and Socrates. They used to look at the city and discover the condition of the soul of humanity by looking at how humanity plays out over the city. Now we're looking at that globally and wondering how it might play out. Fascinating stuff.
So I was reviewing your book, Doom, this morning, and I've been wanting to talk to you about it for a long time. I'm very interested in the apocalyptic vision and its implications for political organization and psychological organization as well. And I thought I'd just start with a couple of comments to get us going. The apocalypse in some ways is always upon us, and you write about that in your book. I mean, because people might ask, well, why has mankind always been consumed at the narrative level with notions of the end of the world? And the answer to that is, at least in part, because we always inhabit demarcated conceptual worlds and even embodied worlds, and all of those worlds do come to an end. And so the idea that there's a universal end is built into the fabric of reality, and it's something that we have to permanently contend with. And so it's there as a lurking existential abyss, but it's also there as a practical problem that we have to contend with. And the grand apocalyptic visions, the book of Revelation, for example, are in part attempts to structure our apprehension of the eternal apocalypse, and to also help us determine practically and politically how that might be at least staved off, although perhaps even managed more comprehensively.
Is the apocalyptic vision something that we have created, a structure that we have implemented to try and deal with maybe just, we see human mortality, we see sort of things breaking down, we see it in nature, and is it something that we have created, or is it something that has been revealed to us? Because I think how you answer that question, whether you think it's humanity trying to create for ourselves some sort of structure to deal with the impending end, or if the ultimate end has been revealed to us, that is how you orientate yourself to that question. I think is very important because it will determine how you live day to day. It's not is and I think it will determine the strength of that structure, because I think in some ways it is a narrative structure, but it's not just a narrative structure. It's a narrative structure that has been revealed by an infinite personal God. That I think is a distinction worthy of being made, because any human or any structure that is of human origin will not be able to withstand the ever-increasing pressure of time, and it certainly will not withstand the end of time, or any apocalypse, or even any personal trauma that we might have. But if you can locate yourself in a story that has been revealed by an infinite, personal, loving, just, and righteous God, then I think we have something. We have something there that can help us live. We have something there that can help us even globally kind of deal with any sort of apocalypse. Maybe not deal with, but help us to know how to live. What should I do when I'm faced with that apocalypse? Well, humbly submit to the lordship of Christ, because therein is freedom. Right? That would be, and I come at this from a Christian perspective. They're going to talk about the book of Revelation, so that is my bias. And if that bias is blinding me from anything, please let me know, because I want to learn from people who have different opinions than I do. And certainly I don't see everything. But for me, there's no other way to meet the apocalypse head on, whether it's your own personal apocalypse or whether it is the actual end of humanity. So I know I kind of went long on that, but I do think it's an important distinction. It's not something it is not a structure we created. It is a narrative that has been revealed to us. And we participate in that narrative.
I guess I'm curious, like, why did your interests, do you think, coalesce around the conception of doom? And it's been a couple of years now since this book was published. How have your conceptions changed? And what did you learn as a consequence of investigating this narrative trope so deeply?
There's a great sketch in the Beyond the Fringe album, which goes right back to Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett in the 1960s. And the sketch is The End of the World, and it's essentially a sect of millenarians who gather on a hill to anticipate the end of the world. They have a long and quite amusing discussion about what it's likely to involve. Will the veil of the temple be rent asunder? And the time comes, they count down to the end of the world, and nothing happens. And Peter Cook, who's the leader of the sect, ends the sketch by, well, never mind, lads, same time next week. And I always thought that was very funny, because the end of the world has been consistently overpredicted by human beings for millennia.
Yeah, that is hilarious. I mean, that is hilarious, right? That and particularly he'll develop this a little bit more, but the church has been guilty of that, or maybe certain people within the church have been guilty of that. And the danger then is the atheist or whoever will look at that, and then it discredits the heavenly vision that is also being presented by the church. So, So stop it. Stop trying to predict it. The end. Jesus literally says, like, no, you're not going to know. So stop trying to predict it. And yet here we are, sort of making fools of ourselves. And that is funny. And yet the casualty of that is that if you can discredit people because they're ridiculous and they keep predicting the end times and getting it wrong, then their whole other heavenly vision that I think will provide people hope is also being discredited with that.
We're fascinated by the idea of the end of the world, and I think it's for a slightly different reason from the one that you hypothesized. We have the reality that we as individuals end to contend with. That's just one of the givens of human life. even for billionaires in Silicon Valley, right now, the end of their individual lives is inevitable.
And yet they're trying to stave it off, right? As is everybody else, except they have more resources. And on the subject of sort of human mortality, we did do some of that. We touched on that in I think it was the Mysterious Origins of Christianity. Actually, it was this in this Graham Hancock one, the next apocalypse where he's really concerned with people sort of coping with the fear of death and puts out the idea that DMT might be a thing that would help with that. And so then the question is, how much should we try to alleviate pain and fear in our lives? Or is there an alternative, which is to allow that fear, that pain, even that trauma to move us towards the Lordship of Christ, the glory of God, and He can do something with that pain, that fear, that trauma that we could never imagine, that no drug on earth could possibly help us with. He can actually transform that trauma into something good. And The Healing Path is a great book on that subject by Dan Allender. If you want to look that up, I'll leave a link in the bottom. So I really do think the heavenly, maybe it's just like the biblical Christian worldview, but the heavenly vision comes in, and at least for me, certainly it gives me answers to all these little pockets of this conversation: human mortality, but also sort of end times apocalyptic vision, and where does that fit with everything?
And that's really the hardest thing to deal with about life, that it ends. And we also know how it ends. We know what that's like, because at some time or another in our lives, we encountered death, the death of a grandparent, a parent, of a friend. We also see things being destroyed. We see buildings collapse, or bridges. We see fires consume areas of woodland. So we know what dissolution looks like, not just for us as individuals, but we know what it looks like for expanses of land or edifices.
And yet, for the atheist, there really shouldn't be a distinction, right? Okay, call me out on this if you're going to disagree. Human beings are matter. Forests are made of matter. The destruction of a forest and the end of life for a human being, truly in the atheist worldview, if we're being consistent, is not any different, except, and I feel like that's tragic. I would say both are trauma, but one is certainly of a different kind than the other. The death of a loved one is certainly traumatic on a much different level than the burning down of a forest. And I think that's where we have to recapture, not reimagine, but just we need to come into contact with the true heavenly vision that God has revealed to us. If we don't, we are stuck. We're stuck in kind of like a hopeless system.
And I think we therefore infer the consoling thought that it's all going to go down in flames at some future date. And the great monotheistic religions have as one of their centerpieces the end of the world. It's there in Islam as well as in Christianity. And I think it's also exciting. I think we find the end of the world a kind of a cinematic prospect, which is why there are so many movies about it as well as works of science fiction. So we're fascinated by the end of the world because it's clearly a spectacular prospect, but it's also consoling to us. We may die as individuals, but everything's going down at some point.
I actually kind of like this take, the idea of like, if I'm going down, everybody's going down with me. I mean, I think there's a kingdom of man aspect of this, and there's a kingdom of heaven aspect of this. And they're two very different stories. I think that everybody wants to feel like they're a part of that story. And I think if you have the kingdom of heaven vision, you realize you are part of that story. It's a story that's been revealed to you by the infinite, personal, loving, just God that we just talked about. If you have the kingdom of man, it's just you. It's just you. It just truly is arrogant pride, self-centeredness. If you're going down, you're taking everybody with you. And maybe you have some small sense of purpose that you feel being a part of the end of all humanity. That's really it. That's the highest that your heavenly vision could get you is if I'm going down, everybody else is going down with me. But the kingdom of God connects you to a much bigger story. It allows you to place yourself on the map of human history. And although we feel this, if I'm going down, everybody else is going down, because we are a part, we are kind of all connected. The trauma that I've experienced is very different than the trauma that you have experienced. But in a way, we are connected. And so if I'm going down, we are all going down. Not because I'm the center of reality, but because I'm a small part of a much bigger story. But I have a place in that story, and you have a place in that story. And so that heavenly vision, that kingdom of heaven vision, really does kind of give us that sense that if I'm going down, we're all going down, but in a very different way, I guess, than the sort of kingdom of man, which would just leave you with a sense of hubris at the end of your life or at the end of humanity. I don't know. So there's something to that, and maybe I don't have that quite fleshed out. So if you have thoughts there, I'd love to hear that.
And the issue is when. So many Christians at successive periods in the history of Christianity have anticipated quite an imminent end of the world. And of course, they're always disappointed, like Peter Cook and Dudley Moore.
And this is because as Christians, we have this sense of the already but not yet kingdom, right? Jesus came, and the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, I'll use both interchangeably, sorry, not sure which one to pick. It has been inaugurated, but it has not yet been consummated. So there is this sense as a Christian that the end is already, it's like it is imminent. It is right before you. I talked about this in one of the previous podcasts about the parable of the 10 virgins. Half of them were wise, half of them were foolish. The wise ones were the ones who lived as though the bridegroom was coming today, but they prepared for the delay of the bridegroom. So when the bridegroom was delayed, they were still able to keep their light shining. And so there is that already but not yet aspect of the kingdom that I think most Christians, maybe all, sense. I think that's probably something that gets misunderstood as far as people that maybe don't experience that are not Christians. They're kind of on the outside of Christianity looking at it going, why are you guys so weird? Like this might be why.
So the consoling issue, the easy read on that, I suppose, is that the end of the world is the precondition for the establishment of an ever more glorious paradise. And you can understand a consolation in that. But you're pointing to a different kind of consolation, I suppose, which is, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that something like Schadenfreude is that the fact that we end is easier to swallow if we understand it in relationship to the potential end of everything. So I don't exactly understand why you highlighted consolation. I can see it in the heavenly vision, let's say, post-apocalypse, but you seem to be pointing to something else.
See, that's what he's saying. If there is no heavenly vision, what real consolation is there that you are just a part of the end of everything? And I guess kind of the more diabolical side of that would be that you are deriving some sense of pleasure or consolation because of the suffering of other people. So that's even more kind of diabolical than even the pride and arrogance that I had mentioned. Schadenfreude. I should have looked that up.
Well, of course, religion offers an afterlife that will be better, and resurrection in the case of the great monotheistic religions. But I don't think that's always what's in people's minds when they contemplate the end of the world. I was very struck as I was researching the book how many times in the midst of a localized disaster, individuals said it felt like the end of the world. So when you're in the midst of a massive conflagration, the biggest wildfire in US history, or when you're in London during the Blitz, when you're in the midst of some localized disaster, it seems somehow consoling to say, oh, it's clearly the end of the world. So I don't think it's just that people say, and therefore I can look forward to being reunited with my ancestors in some happy afterlife. I think there's just a sense that if everybody's going down, that doesn't make it quite so bad as if it's just me.
Well, and could it be both?
Well, there might be another element to it as well. I think we can see in the confrontation with Cataclysm an adventure. That's what people are doing in a theater when they're watching the Terminator series. It's a dreadful adventure, but it's a total adventure. It's completely engrossing. And it might be that you could imagine, and I think that this is part of the emphasis of the Judeo-Christian notion of ultimate sacrifice. You could imagine welcoming the apocalyptic reality of the world with open arms, being willing to undergo that adventure of continual death and transformation, and that transforming it, that entire death and rebirth process into something like the most exciting possible adventure. I mean, what you do see in the biblical corpus, there's always a wrestling with the apocalyptic reality of existence, socially and individually. And there is the insistence throughout the text that the appropriate way to deal with that is not to run from it or deny it, but to really, to the degree that it's possible, to welcome it with open arms. Now, that's a very tricky thing to manage, obviously. The death, how do you welcome the death of everything with open arms? But in some ways, it doesn't matter because it's a reality that people have to face.
Shwoo, shwoo, shwoo. There's lots there. This is Romans chapter 6. It's in the context of sin, death to sin. How shall we who have died to sin still live in it? But I think there's also something to what Jordan is saying in this context that I hope is helpful. Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death? Therefore, we've been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. And this to me is not some idea. When we as Christians talk about the person of Jesus, we are talking about a person in history, in real space and time. So his death was a real death in space and time. His resurrection is a real resurrection, not the idea of resurrection. And that is kind of the next piece that will help us locate ourselves on the map of reality as we maybe face an apocalyptic vision. It's that heavenly vision that sort of swoops in and says, no, you can endure this. You can endure this. Why? Because there is true resurrection. There is true life at the end of that kind of dark tunnel. Not just the idea of resurrection, actual resurrection. You will share in his resurrection? I mean, that's crazy. That's like... And maybe crazy enough just to be true, and maybe crazy enough just to be our only hope. So, yeah, that's why I thought this conversation was really important.
I think what's fascinating about the book of Revelation is that it's so spectacular. It's an extraordinary visualization of a cataclysm, and it's really very elaborate. It's worth reading and trying to picture it in your mind, and you realize that you would need the most advanced computer graphics to realize it on a screen.
And why would you? Because it's revelation. It's not something that the human mind constructed. It is something that is revealed to you. A.W. Tozer has a fascinating quote about this. This is the A.W. Tozer quote. This is from Knowledge of the Holy. When the Spirit would acquaint us with something that lies beyond the field of our knowledge, he tells us that this thing is like something we already know. But he is always careful to phrase his description so as to save us from slavish literalism. For example, when the prophet Ezekiel saw heaven open and beheld visions of God, he found himself looking at that which he had no language to describe. What he was seeing was wholly different from anything he had ever known before, so he fell back upon the language of resemblance. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coal of fire. The nearer he approaches the burning throne, the less sure his words become. And above the firmament there was over their heads was like the likeness of a throne, as the appearance of sapphire stone, and upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness as the appearance of a man upon it. And I saw, as the color of amber, as the appearance of the fire around about it, within it. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Strange as this language is, it doesn't create the impression of unreality. one gathers that the whole scene is very real, but entirely alien to anything men know on earth. So in order to convey an idea of what he sees, the prophet must employ such words as likeness, appearance, as it were, and the likeness of the appearance. Even the throne becomes the appearance of a throne, and he that sits upon it, though like a man, is so unlike one that he can be described only as the likeness of the appearance of a man. And so as we sort of grasp for this heavenly vision, I felt like it's unfortunate that we are hearing it from someone who maybe doesn't quite have the vision of an Ezekiel or an A.W. Tozer. And I think we as Christians, if we want to offer people true hope in an age that does seem rather apocalyptic, we need to have a better vision ourselves of that heavenly kingdom.
I think it's partly that you need a spectacular prelude for the kingdom of God to be plausible. Because the terrible truth about the kingdom of God is that it does sound quite dull. I mean, the reality about the saints and angels and God himself is that they don't really know how to throw a party.
We should take this criticism. We should take this criticism and learn from it. What you're hearing is, and Neil, he does later say in the interview that he's an atheist, is giving you some very constructive feedback that heaven sounds quite dull. So much so that the apocalypse seems rather interesting, which is why we're fascinated about the apocalypse. I would say as a Christian, the apocalypse is quite boring compared to the eventual glory of heaven, that this cataclysmic, world-ending, humanity-ending event is actually a pretty tame prelude to the overwhelming weight of glory that we would behold having come face to face with the glory of God. Everything else pales in comparison of that. But when you hear someone who's not a believer give you this feedback, we have to realize that we have done a really poor job of framing this idea for people who, like, I agree. Like, before I became a Christian, I didn't grow up in a Christian church. Before I became a Christian, I held this exact same belief. I thought the party was in the other place. I thought the party was in hell. That's what I thought, because it was campy. It was the idea of heaven was like ethereal, like we were all going to be light balls, whatever, bouncing around, singing, these songs that you hear at these Christian summer camps. And you even hear people, they stand up on the stage and they'll say, "Isn't this so great? We're going to be singing this song for eternity in heaven." And I just go, yuck. Like, this music sucks. I don't want to sing this forever. And so, yeah, we need to do a better job. This is where C.S. Lewis comes in. Again, we sort of need those public theologians to help us. And when I read this, it just blew me away. This was so helpful for me. This is C.S. Lewis writing about his character's journey from the valley of the shadow of death to the valley of the shadow of life. So he's not even in heaven yet. He's in the valley that leads you up to that heavenly kingdom, the true glory. And yet the glory that he describes, even in the valley leading up to it, is pretty fascinating. He says, "At first, of course, my attention was caught by my fellow passengers. They all arrive by a bus, and they're all sitting in the bus, and then they try to get out. They were still grouped about the neighborhood of the omnibus, though beginning, some of them, to walk forward into the landscape with hesitating steps. I gasped when I saw them. Now that they were in the light, they were transparent, fully transparent, when they stood between me and it, smudgy and imperfectly opaque when they stood in the shadow of some tree. They were in fact ghosts, man-shaped stains on the brightness of that air." man-shaped stains on the brightness of the air of heaven. One could attend to them or ignore them, as well as you do with dirt on a window pane. I noticed that the grass did not bend under their feet. Even the dewdrops were not disturbed. The dew is not disturbed by our... And these would be people that you would say would have material bodies, physical material bodies. Worldly bodies cannot even disrupt the dew on the grass, let alone the grass itself. But it gets better. Then some readjustment of the mind or some focusing of my eyes took place, and I saw the whole phenomenon the other way around. The men were as they always had been, as all men I had known had been, perhaps. It was the light, the grass, the trees that were different, made of some different substance, so much solider than the things in our country, that men were ghosts by comparison. That line right there changed my life and gave me at least something of a more accurate heavenly vision. It went from crappy, campy songs played by beams of light bouncing around on clouds to the idea that no, we think this world is real. That world is far more real. It's made of much more solid stuff. And I grew up in Yosemite. I grew up in the Valley of Yosemite, one of the most beautiful places on earth. And I readjusted in some ways because after I became a Christian, I looked at that valley with a fresh set of ideas because I had always looked at it as one of the most beautiful places on this planet. And yet I realized it's going to be more beautiful still when it is recreated, when it comes to its fullness, when it is as God intended it to be. Because again, God doesn't do away with this world. And that's the other thing that I think people have to readjust in their imagination. It's that we are as we were intended to be, as we were in Eden, in that paradisal place. This is where Dante, it just is so helpful. We've lost some of these classic works, and as I read Dante, I got to Paradiso. I'm bad at that. I got to paradise, and I didn't understand it because I'm looking at it with too earthly of an idea, and it's in a way like that vision of Ezekiel. It's almost like we struggle to find language, and maybe that's why we're not very good at communicating what the heavenly vision is, what it should be, how we might elevate our imagination so it could come closer to grasping that heavenly vision. C.S. Lewis goes on. He says, "Moved by a sudden thought, I bent down and tried to pluck a daisy which was growing at my feet. The stalk wouldn't break. I tried to twist it, but it wouldn't twist. I tugged till the sweat stood out of my forehead, and I had lost most of the skin on my hands. The little flower was hard, not like wood or even like iron, but like diamond. There was a leaf, a young, tender beech leaf, laying in the grass beside it. I tried to pick up the leaf. My heart almost cracked with the effort, and I believe I did just raise it. But I had to let it go at once. It was heavier than a sack of coal. As I stood recovering my breath with great gasps and looking down at the daisy, I noticed that I could see the grass not only between my feet, but through them. I also was a phantom. Who will give me words to express the terror of that discovery? Golly, I thought, I'm in for it this time. That is the heavenly vision that we are trying to capture. That is the heavenly vision that we need, a world that is more real than this world that we are ghosts by comparison. So I want to follow this conversation as it moves from the individual scale to the global scale. This is the experiment that Socrates proposes in the Republic, that if we have the sickness of the soul diagnosed properly on the individual level, we'll see that kind of expanded outward as we move from the individual to the city, and in our context, the globe. And they're going to go into sort of the geopolitical arena, which I think is actually important, because as we kind of come full circle and all the way back, the same solution that I apply individually to the question of how should I live is really going to affect how we look at the global scale of that solution. And so if you're still with me at this point, I really do appreciate you being here. If you found meaning in conversations like this, I'll just ask you to share it with somebody. Like the video if you like it, subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help sort of build community around meaningful things. I find a lot of meaning in engaging with you guys. So thank you for being with me, and we're going to get into this next part.
What did you conclude when you have a chapter on developing political incompetence and also one on, a sort of a belief in scientism. And that seems to me to be part of your attempt to assess the local failure while we're concentrating on the global apocalypse. And so what do you make of that concatenation of causal forces?
There are two things that are going on, I think. One is that the more people refer to the science, the more you should suspect that they are engaged in some quasi-religious activity, because the notion of some settled body of knowledge called the science is at odds with the reality of the scientific method, which is a constant struggle to falsify hypotheses through experimentation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think it predates it, it was already going on in debates about climate, there was a lot of spurious invocation of the science. And one might as well have been saying the gods or the deity, because it was, in fact, quite unscientific thinking.
This is where kind of modern naturalistic humanity people are really caught, because we've spent the last 150 years or so denying that the spirits exist. And as we engage in, this is air quotes, science, we stumble into the arena of necromancy. We stumble into the arena of the spirits. But the danger is we've denied the spirits. So we're in this arena not really knowing that what they think they're doing is science. What they're actually doing is necromancy. This is That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. This is kind of the point that he was making. And so the pre-modern person at least knew that the spiritual arena was out there. They could take stock of it, and they knew how to navigate it to some degree, certainly far more than the sort of modern naturalistic approach, which has denied that those forces exist and yet tries to move into the arena where those forces do exist. We cannot deny the spiritual reality of the world that we live in. And so we're stuck. And then, having denied that that arena exists, the solution cannot be grasped by the sort of modern naturalistic approach. You don't have access to the solution because you've denied that that arena even exists.
Right. So this kind of wrongheadedness leads to all kinds of policy errors, because people are focused on the satisfaction of asceticism, the virtue signaling that comes with getting rid of nuclear power stations or internal combustion engines. So there's kind of generalized failure which embraces the policy elite to think rationally about the problems that we're trying to address. The second problem, which I think is just as important, is the way the administrative state functions. If you compare central governments today with their counterparts of half a century or 70 years ago, they've become much larger, they're very bloated in terms of the numbers of people employed. They intervene in many more ways. There's an enormous corpus of regulation in all Western countries.
These are the giants that Jordan Peterson was talking about at the beginning.
And this administrative state, unwieldy, regulatory, is very inefficient. It's very bad at achieving its intended goals. And that has to do with the way that bureaucracy works and the sclerotic tendencies that the modern state suffers from. So between the science as a quasi-religious way of thinking and the administrative state, we have a very, very dysfunctional approach to nearly all the problems that confront us. And that is really the central argument of doom. It's very significant that in our lifetimes, governments have got worse at dealing with disasters, not better. Despite the accumulation of scientific knowledge, we seem somehow collectively to be worse at scientific thinking.
Yeah, and so again, this is the sort of the lie of the evolutionary model, is that somehow over time we're getting better, but really over time we seem to be getting worse. And so I do think that a lot of people are looking into the wisdom of the ancient past for some of those answers. That's kind of what we're doing here. As a Christian, I'm going to point to scripture that is God's revelation, but it's also this sort of ancient book. It's this ancient story because we kind of have this like hopeless, and that's why sort of nihilism is beckoning to us, this just hopelessness that we have inherited from kind of a modern naturalistic or secular sort of approach to some of these solutions.
Okay, so imagine this. You magnify the size of the apocalypse, right? So it becomes a world-ending Ragnarok. Then you magnify the size of the bureaucratic state because you have to in order to deal with that apocalypse, okay? Then because the state is so global and large and so central, it loses its connection with the real world. It has no subsidiary organization, and then it flails about pointlessly. Now, I'm going to walk through a couple of narrative representations of that, and it'll tie it back to the imagery of Revelation. You might find this interesting. So you see that dynamic play out in the opening chapters of Genesis, because what you have is the descendants of Cain. So Cain makes improper sacrifices, and he becomes bitter and resentful, and he turns to technology. It's Cain's descendants that turn to technology first. They build the first cities. And then the city becomes corrupt. It becomes corrupt in the direction of the Tower of Babel.
The people who built the city were corrupt, and so their corruption was magnified. Okay, so again, I keep returning to this idea of Socrates from the Republic. But this is an important point because we just did several videos dealing with giants and Babel and the connection. We actually, there's a live stream, and I will link that for you guys if you're interested in looking at this deeper. But I just love that Jordan Peterson is so stuck on the Cain and Abel story, and yet sort of painfully misses. He's fixated on Cain because the story does sort of follow Cain, but God is looking at Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's sacrifice. And so Abel's sacrifice is a blood sacrifice of the innocent on behalf of the guilty. The reason God looks at Abel's sacrifice is that is a clue to where we need to go if we're wanting solutions to the problem of the sickness of the soul, which has been magnified into the arena of the city. So I love that he loves that story, but every time he brings it up, I've sort of got, he's getting half of it.
Now, the Tower of Babel is a ziggurat, right? It's a stepped pyramid. And at that time, the potentates of the Middle East were competing to build the largest ziggurats. They were trying to build towers to heaven to glorify themselves. And that's the subtext of the Tower of Babel story. So what happens is that the ultimate Tower of Babel is erected to reach to the sky, and that's a challenge to the supremacy of God. And the consequence of that is that the cosmos, the spirit of the cosmos, the creative producer of the cosmos, makes all those who inhabit the tower unable to communicate with one another. So they start to lose even the ability to share concepts, and the structure collapses. And it's because that Tower of Babel is too large, it reaches too high, it's too uniform, and it's destined to failure. Of course, that begs the question, what's the alternative to that? But I would say the entire remaining biblical corpus is actually an attempt to answer that question, but it's very germane. Now, that imagery is picked up again in the book of Revelation. So one of the central images in the book that I think is very relevant, imagine that the book of Revelation is trying to conceptualize the apocalypse as such, the manner in which things deteriorate before the ultimate disaster. And so one of the main images is of a seven-headed beast. And on the back of the beast is the whore of Babylon. And it's an image of a centralizing state, a monstrous centralizing state, that's a good way of thinking about it, with multiple heads, with something like disinhibited licentiousness as its partner. That's the image. And so the notion there is that when things deteriorate to the point where apocalypse is likely, you have the construction of monstrous state-like apparatuses aligned with individual fragmentation down to the point of licentious atomization. That's a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, so if you are following that, it's so fascinating because this interview came out after we did the live stream on connecting Genesis to the book of Revelation. My hypothesis is that yes, the Tower of Babel is about human pride, but it's also about something much more, that when humanity is united in defiance of Yahweh, they have an ability to either manifest, create, or at least feed the spirit of the age, the spirit of man. The kingdom of man grows out of control, so much so that humanity is going to destroy itself. So God actually intervenes to save humanity. That's the story of Noah. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. He breaks up the power of that egregore, the spirit of man or the kingdom of man, into these different tribal, pagan nations now. So you have all these little smaller tribes. So again, maybe check out that live stream. We go into more detail on that. But now we're thinking about it in the geopolitical arena of our modern day and say, okay, what sort of beast are we facing? Because that to me is kind of the link between Babel and Genesis, is that the beast that is called forth is sort of a manifestation of that human sin. It's the manifestation of human arrogance, this defiance of God. And then, of course, the beast comes to enslave humanity. So there's a certain power that beast has. And again, I'm sort of working this out. So I would love to hear some feedback on this. But the beast is sort of represented by these world forces, if we look at Ephesians 6, that we tend to look at in the political arena, but they are more than that. Again, I don't want to make the same mistake as the modern naturalistic person and just look at it as like, oh, that's just happening in the political arena. No, the reason it's happening in the political arena is that there's something else happening in the spiritual arena, and those are not distinct and separate. They're part of one world.
You know, you're striving towards, it seems to me in your argument, you're striving towards the hypothesis that there's something like an out-of-control gigantism that's causally related to the inability of these bureaucratic organizations to actually respond to actual occurrences in the world.
So two thoughts. There's only one law of history. I'm a historian, and that's the law of unintended consequences. And so what typically happens is that well-intentioned people come to power, identify a problem which they feel they must address, and they undertake measures to address the problem which have unintended consequences. This was true when, back in the 1960s and 70s, people persuaded themselves that there was a terrible problem of overpopulation, that Malthus was going to be vindicated, and therefore there had to be drastic population control, especially in Asia. And that turned out to have all kinds of unintended consequences. In our time, fears not just of climate change, but of dangerous technological developments have given rise to a view which my friend Nick Bostrom in Oxford exemplifies, that we need to have very, very powerful surveillance powers to prevent bad things from happening, whether it's to prevent CO2 emissions in reaching the levels of the net zero program, or whether it's to stop dangerous research being done with artificial intelligence. We need to empower the state to have even greater powers of surveillance than the mid-20th century totalitarian regimes had. And so one of the key arguments in the book Doom is that actually totalitarianism is the thing most to be feared. In the 20th century, totalitarian regimes cause way more premature death than anything else. And so the last thing we should want to do in the 21st century is to create new forms of totalitarianism out of a belief that only an all-seeing state can prevent disaster.
And so I had just said that I was going to disagree with him, his analysis, because he's talking about these well-intended people. I don't know that I see well-intended people. I see people who are trying to exploit other people. I see people taking advantage of catastrophes and trauma and this sort of apocalypse that might be upon us, taking advantage of people's fears of their own mortality or that apocalypse to gain their own power and influence. And part of the reason I think that that is true, and you let me know, is that that's the same problem we saw individually. We're seeing it now globally, on a global scale. We had said that if you don't have a heavenly vision, a vision of that heavenly kingdom, all you're left with is to console yourself with the pain of other people, that if I'm going down, everybody else is going down with me. Now we're seeing that sort of blown up, and people are not, these world forces, this totalitarianism is not trying to solve the problem. It's not trying to prevent cataclysm. And this answers his question from earlier. Why, with so many technological advancements, have we gotten worse at solving these problems? Because they're not trying to solve them. They're benefiting off of them. These world forces are gaining more power and more influence the more they can perpetuate these problems. And so if that's true, then I think the solution individually can be applied more broadly as well. And so I just sort of go back. There's several scriptures that I could share. I'll probably leave them in the comments. But this is Romans 8. For we have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. That's that heavenly vision. For I consider that the suffering of this present time, they're not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to be revealed to us. So our heavenly vision needs to increase, and I think it puts in perspective what's going on sort of geopolitically. For the anxious longing of creation awaits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So now it's not even just God's glory. It's actually we are sharing in that glory, and creation gets to share in that glory through us. For we know the whole creation groans and suffers pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but we also ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. And so we hope for those things that we don't quite see perfectly, yet we hope for those things. We live in that already but not yet kingdom tension, and yet in the midst of that, I think that we have a huge advantage, because I think when you live coram Deo, when you live your life before the face of God, when you live as a kingdom person, then, I think about it like this, like prayer or communion or baptism, Bible study, worship, evangelism, the things that we partake of as kingdom people on the surface seem maybe insignificant in view of these gigantic geopolitical forces. But that is because we don't see the kingdom of God for what it truly is. Our heavenly vision needs to be elevated that will put these seemingly gigantic forces into perspective. They're not that big. Look at Job. God's talking about the behemoth, how he holds the behemoth in his hand. These political forces, these world forces, are small in comparison to the kingdom of God. And so you might think prayer is something that is insignificant, that it won't move the needle much, but it will. And we need to see that. We need to have a proper vision of God and how big God is. And what that will do is actually shrink these seemingly gigantic forces down to their proper size, so that when we evangelize, when we share the good news with people, that changes eternity. That changes eternity. And so, again, and maybe tying this back into the Calvinism thing that I'm not sure if I'll leave that in or cut that out, but the idea is that I've been given a gift from God. I don't deserve it. And now I'm a steward of that gift. And what should I do? Well, if you live as a person who is an outpost, a way station for the kingdom of God, then you are a force for good in this world. That is, the goodness that is in you far outweighs any of the evil or tyranny or slavery of those world forces that we see. So I hope this is encouraging for you, that we can have that heavenly vision. I feel like I'm sort of rushing here at the conclusion, because I'm trying to get my brother to the airport, but maybe we'll pick up this theme in another video, and I will leave links to those other videos in the description. Maybe I'll even put a playlist together because I think that this is worthy of the time and attention that we can give it. How do I live in this world. I live as a kingdom person. How do I live as a kingdom person? I have to have a heavenly vision, a true heavenly vision. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.